March 15, 1945. A cold morning at Camp Green Lake, Pennsylvania. In the women's mess hall of a prisoner of war facility that housed 43 German women, something unprecedented was about to happen. The kind of moment that would be retold in letters, whispered about in barracks, and decades later recounted to grandchildren with voices still touched by disbelief. When Sergeant Peter Kowalski placed metal trays before the assembled prisoners that morning, 24-year-old Katrin Bergman did something she had not done since her capture 3 months earlier. She gasped audibly. On the tray before her sat 2 fried eggs, their yolks golden and intact. Beside them lay 3 thick slices of ham, glistening with fat. A pile of scrambled eggs filled another section of the tray, yellow and fluffy. 2 pieces of white bread, real white bread, sat buttered and warm. And in a small cup, steam rising in delicate curls, was coffee. Real coffee. Not the roasted acorn, or substitute she had choked down for the past 2 years in Germany. Not the chicory mixture that left a bitter coating on the tongue. Actual coffee, its aroma rich enough to make her eyes water. Beside her, 21-year-old Sophie Klein had frozen completely, her hands hovering over her own identical tray, as if touching it might make it disappear. Around them, the other German women sat in similar states of shock, staring at their breakfast trays like they had been presented with crown jewels rather than food. Sergeant Kowalski, a stocky man with kind eyes and the thick accent of his Polish immigrant parents, noticed their reaction and misunderstood it entirely. "Something wrong with the eggs?" he asked, concerned. "Cook can make them over easy if you prefer, just let me know." Katrin found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "This is for all of us? Each person?" The sergeant looked confused. "Well, yeah, it's Wednesday, standard breakfast. We do ham and eggs on Wednesdays and Saturdays, bacon on the other days." He paused, studying their faces. "You girls okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Standard breakfast?" The words hung in the air like an impossible promise. Katrin looked down at her tray again, mentally calculating what this single meal represented. In Berlin, her family's weekly ration card for an entire week provided less protein than what sat before her right now. Her mother would have made this amount of ham last for 4 people for 3 days, stretching it with potatoes and hope. The eggs alone, 2 of them, whole and perfect, were something she had not seen since 1942. Across the table, Helga Zimmermann, at 32, the oldest among them and a former nurse, had begun to cry silently. Tears ran down her weathered face as she stared at the butter melting into the bread. Real butter. Not the gray margarine substitute that tasted like salted paste. Not the lard they had learned to spread thin to make it last. Actual butter, golden and generous, more than any German civilian had seen in years. 6 months earlier, in September of 1944, Katrin Bergman had stepped off a military transport truck onto American soil, with her heart hammering against her ribs. She and 42 other women from the German Women's Auxiliary Corps had been captured in France as Allied forces swept through occupied territories. During the 3-week journey across the Atlantic, crammed into the hold of a military vessel, they had prepared themselves for what awaited them in America. The propaganda had been clear and consistent. Americans were barbaric. They showed no mercy to prisoners. Starvation, torture, and humiliation would be their fate. Katrin had believed it because she had no reason not to. Now, standing in the September sunshine outside Camp Green Lake, she felt the first stirrings of confusion. The facility before them was not the hellish prison she had imagined. Neat wooden barracks stood in orderly rows. The fencing was there, certainly, but the compound looked almost pleasant, surrounded by Pennsylvania forests beginning their autumn transformation. Captain Virginia Hartman, a tall woman with steel-gray hair and an unreadable expression, stood before the assembled prisoners. Through a translator, she explained the camp rules. They would work. They would follow schedules. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Nothing she said matched what Katrin had been told to expect. The first meal came 2 hours after their arrival. The women filed into the mess hall with the nervous energy of people expecting the worst. What they received instead was a plate of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a roll. Real food. Hot food. More food on a single plate than Katrin had seen at one time in over a year. Sophie Klein, who had been assigned the bunk next to Katrin's, stared at her plate with wide eyes. She was younger than Katrin by 3 years, with blonde hair cut short for practicality and a face that still held traces of teenage softness despite the hardships of war. "This is a trick," Sophie whispered in German. "They are fattening us before something terrible happens. This cannot be real." But it was real. The chicken was tender, seasoned with herbs Katrin could not identify. The potatoes were creamy with real milk and butter. The beans were not the withered, preserved vegetables she had grown accustomed to, but fresh and green. And when she bit into the roll, still warm from the oven, she had to close her eyes against the sudden rush of memory. Her grandmother's kitchen before the war. Sunday dinners. The smell of baking bread that had once been so ordinary she never thought to treasure it. That first evening, lying in her bunk in the women's barracks, Katrin wrote in the small journal she had managed to keep hidden through her capture. "Today the Americans fed us like human beings. I do not understand why. Nothing makes sense anymore. Either everything we were told about the enemy was a lie, or this is the cruelest deception of all." Katrin could not stop thinking about the ration cards. In her first weeks at Camp Green Lake, as meal after impossible meal appeared before her, her mind kept returning to the small pieces of paper that had governed every aspect of life in wartime Germany. She remembered the color-coded system with painful clarity. The blue cards for meat, though meat had become increasingly theoretical. The red cards for bread, which bought you darker, heavier loaves as the war progressed and wheat became scarce. The green cards for vegetables, though by 1943, even those who had cards often found empty shelves at the shops. Her mother had become an artist of scarcity. Frau Bergmann could make a single chicken leg feed 4 people, stretching it with potatoes, turnips, and the desperation that hunger breeds. She saved every scrap of fat, every bone for broth, every wilted vegetable leaf. Nothing was wasted because waste meant hunger. Katrin remembered her younger brother, 12-year-old Hans, asking at dinner one evening in 1943 why they could not have butter on their bread anymore. Her mother had smiled with a brightness that did not reach her eyes and explained that butter was needed for the soldiers at the front. They were making sacrifices for the fatherland. Hans had nodded solemnly and eaten his bread dry without complaint, as they all did. But Katrin had seen her mother's hands shake as she portioned out the evening meal, calculating in her head whether the rations would last until the next distribution day. Coffee had disappeared first, replaced by roasted acorns ground into powder that produced a bitter brown liquid bearing no resemblance to the real thing. Then sugar became precious, rationed in quantities so small that her mother kept it locked in a tin, doling out single crystals for special occasions. Eggs vanished from their table entirely. Katrin could not remember the last time she had seen a fresh egg in Berlin before her deployment to France. Meat became a memory. The official ration was 100 grams per week, but even that paltry amount was rarely available. They learned to eat horse meat without flinching. They learned to be grateful for sausages that contained more bread than animal. They learned that the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs was something called patriotic sacrifice. Sophie's experience in Dresden had been similar, though perhaps worse. She told Katrin one night about how her family had taken to raising rabbits in their apartment courtyard, hiding them from authorities who might confiscate them. How her father had been caught trading on the black market for potatoes and been fined a month's wages. How her mother cried quietly at night, believing no one could hear, worrying about whether her children were getting enough to eat to grow properly. Now, sitting in an American prison camp, they ate 3 full meals a day, every single day, meals that would have fed their entire families back home. The contradiction was devastating. The shared meals created a strange tension in the mess hall during those early weeks. The German women ate in silence, mechanically lifting forks to mouths, chewing food that tasted like an accusation. How could they enjoy this abundance while their families starved? Yet how could they not eat when their bodies, hollowed out by years of rationing, screamed for the nourishment being offered? Sergeant Peter Kowalski seemed determined to bridge the uncomfortable silence. He moved through the mess hall during meals, checking on the prisoners with a friendliness that felt almost aggressive in its persistence. His broken German, learned from his immigrant parents, made communication possible if awkward. "Gut? Food is gut?" he would ask, gesturing at their plates. Most of the women nodded without meeting his eyes. Katrin watched him carefully during these interactions. He was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair and the solid build of someone who had spent his life doing physical work. His hands were calloused, his manner direct but not unkind. Nothing about him suggested cruelty. This confused her more than she wanted to admit. One morning in October, he noticed that Helga Zimmermann had barely touched her breakfast. The older woman sat staring at her plate of pancakes and sausage links as if they had personally offended her. Kowalski approached with concern evident on his weathered face. "You are sick? Need doctor?" he asked in his halting German. Helga looked up at him, and for the first time since their arrival, one of the German women spoke with real emotion instead of mechanical politeness. "How can you feed us like this?" she asked in careful English, her voice shaking. "We are your enemies. We fought against you. Our country killed your soldiers, yet you give us more food than we have seen in years. Why?" The mess hall fell completely silent. Every woman stopped eating. Every American guard turned to watch. Sergeant Kowalski stood very still for a moment, considering his words. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "My parents came from Poland. They came to America because they were hungry. Because in the old country, there was never enough. They told me stories about what hunger does to people. Makes them desperate. Makes them do things they would not do otherwise." He paused, looking around at all the German women who were now listening intently. "You are prisoners, yes, but you are also people. People need to eat. This is America. We have food. We do not make people hungry on purpose. This is not who we are." Corporal Janet Reynolds, standing near the serving line, added her own thoughts in simpler terms. "Back home in Wisconsin, we believe you don't kick someone when they're down. You're already prisoners. You already lost. Making you starve on top of that? That's just meanness, and we weren't raised that way." The words settled over the room like snow, covering everything in a strange new silence. The morning that changed everything for Katrine Bergman began with the smell of coffee. Real coffee. She had been at Camp Green Lake for 2 months, and while the abundance of food still shocked her daily, she had maintained an emotional distance from it all. She ate because her body demanded it, but she refused to feel gratitude toward her captors. That would be betrayal. But on this particular November morning, Private Frank DeLuca carried a large pot through the mess hall, refilling cups with fresh coffee. When he reached Katrin's table, he paused and spoke in his Brooklyn-accented English that Katrin was beginning to understand. "You ladies want real cream? We got some in from a local dairy. Fresh this morning." Sophie Klein, whose English was improving faster than most, translated for the others. Real cream. Not the thin bluish milk substitute they had grown accustomed to in Germany. Not the powdered mixture that never quite dissolved properly. Actual cream, thick and white, and impossible. DeLuca disappeared and returned moments later with a small pitcher. He poured a generous amount into Katrin's cup without waiting for permission. The cream swirled into the dark coffee, creating patterns that mesmerized her. She lifted the cup to her lips and tasted something she had nearly forgotten existed. It was not just coffee. It was proof that everything she had been told was a lie. The propaganda had painted Americans as barbaric savages who hoarded resources and delighted in the suffering of others. Yet here she sat, a prisoner of war, drinking fresh coffee with real cream, while her captors treated her with more consideration than her own government had shown its citizens in years. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful. Helga Zimmermann spoke what they were all thinking. They told us Americans were starving too. That their cities were in ruins from German bombing. That they could barely feed their own soldiers, let alone prisoners. Her voice dropped to a whisper. They told us we were winning the war. Elsa Becker, the youngest among them at 19, had begun to cry quietly. "My brother is at the Eastern Front." He wrote that they were eating grass and tree bark. He said they were fighting for Germany's survival, that the enemy wanted to destroy us completely. But if that is true, Why do our enemies feed us better than our own country did? The question hung in the air, unanswerable and damning. Katrin set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. She thought about the newsreels she had watched in Berlin, showing American prisoners supposedly suffering in German camps. She thought about the speeches promising final victory, about the assurances that sacrifice today would lead to triumph tomorrow. She thought about the ration cards and her mother's increasingly desperate attempts to feed her family. And she thought about this coffee, this simple cup of coffee with cream, and what it revealed about the world she thought she understood. That evening, she wrote in her journal with new urgency. If they lied about something as simple as coffee, what else was a lie? In early December, Captain Virginia Hartman announced that prisoners who wished to volunteer for kitchen duty would receive extra privileges, including access to writing materials and extended recreation time. Katrin raised her hand before she fully understood why. Perhaps it was curiosity about where all this impossible food came from. Perhaps it was the need to do something, anything, other than sit with her increasingly troubled thoughts. Working in the kitchen meant working alongside Americans. Sergeant Kowalski ran the operation with the efficiency of a military man and the passion of someone who genuinely cared about food. Private DeLuca handled most of the cooking, his Italian heritage evident in the way he talked about ingredients like they were old friends. Corporal Janet Reynolds managed inventory and planning with the practical precision of her farming background. On Katrin's first day, Kowalski handed her a sack of potatoes and a peeler. "You know how to peel potatoes, yes?" he asked in his broken German. She almost laughed. Did she know how to peel potatoes? She had peeled potatoes until her hands cramped, stretching every meal, making something from nothing. But these were not the small, withered potatoes she remembered from Berlin. These were large, clean, abundant. There were so many of them. Sophie joined the kitchen volunteers the following week, and together they learned the rhythms of American cooking. The portions shocked them daily. DeLuca would crack a dozen eggs without hesitation for a single meal's scrambled eggs. He used butter with abandon, scooping it from 5-pound blocks that sat in the refrigerator like monuments to plenty. The waste horrified them at first. DeLuca trimmed fat from meat and threw it away, fat that Katrin's mother would have treasured, rendered down for cooking, stretched across a week's meals. When Katrin retrieved a discarded piece from the trash, intending to save it, DeLuca noticed and gently took it from her hands. "We don't need to save that," he said kindly. "We got plenty more." Plenty. The word felt obscene. But as weeks passed, something unexpected happened in that kitchen. Language barriers dissolved in the universal grammar of cooking. Kowalski taught them how Americans liked their eggs. Reynolds showed them how to make biscuits from scratch, a southern recipe her grandmother had perfected. DeLuca shared his mother's technique for red sauce, talking with his hands as much as his words. In return, the German women began to share their own knowledge. Helga knew how to make soup stretch to feed unexpected guests. Sophie could bake bread that stayed fresh for days. Katrin taught them her mother's trick for keeping vegetables crisp, even without refrigeration. Food became a language they all spoke fluently. In the kitchen, they were not captors and prisoners. They were simply people who understood that feeding others was an act of care, regardless of which side of a war you had been born on. The kitchen became neutral ground, where humanity persisted despite everything trying to destroy it. The letter arrived in mid-January of 1945, passed through military censors and Red Cross channels, taking 3 months to travel from Berlin to Pennsylvania. Katrin recognized her mother's handwriting immediately, though the script looked shakier than she remembered. Her hands trembled as she opened the thin envelope in the barracks. The other women grew quiet, understanding the weight of news from home. Her mother's words were carefully chosen, written with the knowledge that censors would read every line. But between the formal phrases and cheerful reassurances, Katrin could read the truth her mother was trying to hide. The rations had been cut again. Her father's factory job no longer provided supplemental food. Hans, now 13, had grown taller but not heavier, all gangly limbs and hunger. They were managing, her mother insisted, but Katrin knew what managing meant. It meant going to bed with stomachs that hurt from emptiness. It meant watering down soup until it was barely more than flavored water. It meant her mother giving her own portions to her children and claiming she had already eaten. Katrin read the letter 3 times, then walked to the mess hall, where she was scheduled for kitchen duty. That day's lunch service was turkey sandwiches with lettuce, tomato, and mayonnaise. Real mayonnaise, not the thin substitute, thick slices of turkey breast, not scraps, fresh vegetables, white bread. She made sandwiches with mechanical precision while her mother's words echoed in her head. "We are managing, we are managing, we are managing." Sophie found her, an hour later, sitting behind the storage building, crying so hard she could barely breathe. Her friend said nothing, just sat beside her and held her hand. Finally, Katrin found her voice. "I ate turkey for lunch today. Turkey. With mayonnaise and fresh bread. I will eat dinner tonight. A full dinner. And tomorrow I will eat 3 meals again. Every day, 3 full meals while my family starves." More letters arrived over the following weeks as the Red Cross connections improved. Helga received news that her sister's children in Munich were suffering from malnutrition. Elsa learned that her elderly parents were surviving on potato peels and hope. Sophie's letter from Dresden described bombing damage and food shortages so severe that people were trading family heirlooms for bread. The guilt became a physical presence in the barracks, sitting on their chests at night, making it hard to breathe. They were prisoners eating better than they had as free women in Germany, better than their families, better than the soldiers supposedly fighting for their country's survival. The moral mathematics were impossible. Every meal became an accusation. Every bite of ham reminded them of empty plates back home. Every egg was one their mothers would never see. Every cup of real coffee was a luxury their families had forgotten existed. Yet their bodies betrayed them daily, growing stronger on American abundance, while their spirits fractured under the weight of misplaced fortune. How could you be grateful and guilty simultaneously? How could food taste like both salvation and sin? November 22, 1945. Katrin had been at Camp Green Lake for over a year now. The war in Europe had ended 6 months earlier, but repatriation remained complicated, delayed by logistics and the chaos of occupied Germany. The German women existed in a strange limbo, no longer quite prisoners but not yet free to leave. Captain Hartmann had announced that the German women would be included in the camp's Thanksgiving celebration. Corporal Reynolds had tried to explain the holiday's significance, speaking slowly in the English that most of the women now understood reasonably well. "A day of gratitude," she said. "A day to give thanks for blessings and abundance." The irony was not lost on Katrin. On Thanksgiving morning, the kitchen became a place of controlled chaos. Sergeant Kowalski had been planning for weeks, ordering supplies, coordinating timing, orchestrating what he called a proper Thanksgiving feast. 3 turkeys roasted in the ovens, their skin turning golden brown. Pots of mashed potatoes sat waiting for butter and cream. Green beans almondine, sweet potato casserole, cranberry sauce, dinner rolls, and 3 different types of pie covered every available surface. Katrin and Sophie helped with preparations, moving through tasks they had learned over months of kitchen duty. But the abundance on display made Katrin's stomach turn. This was not just a meal, this was excess. This was everything her family had never had, multiplied and made grotesque by its sheer plenty. Private DeLuca noticed her distress. He had become surprisingly perceptive about the moods of his German volunteers over the months. "You thinking about home?" he said. It was not a question. Katrin nodded, not trusting her voice. DeLuca wiped his hands on his apron and leaned against the counter. "My nonna, my grandmother, she came from Italy with nothing. She tells me stories about being so hungry she ate grass. Actual grass, like an animal. When she got to America she cried the first time she had enough food. Not because she was sad, but because she could not believe it was real." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She says being grateful for food does not mean you forget the people who are hungry. It means you remember them. You honor them by not wasting what you have been given. You honor them by understanding how precious it is." The feast that afternoon was unlike anything Katrin had experienced. The mess hall had been decorated with autumn leaves and hand-drawn turkeys that some of the younger soldiers had created. American staff and German prisoners sat at the same tables. The usual separation dissolved for this one day. Captain Hartman stood before the assembled group and spoke about gratitude, about the end of war, about the possibility of former enemies sharing a meal in peace. When she finished, Sergeant Kowalski asked if anyone would like to share what they were thankful for. To everyone's surprise, Helga Zimmermann stood up. Her English had improved dramatically over the months. "I am thankful," she said slowly, "that I have lived to see enemies become friends, that I have learned the difference between propaganda and truth, that I have been shown kindness when I expected only punishment." Her voice broke slightly. "And I am thankful that someday I hope to bring this lesson of kindness back to my country so that others might learn what I have learned here." February of 1946 brought the official announcement the German women had been both expecting and dreading. Repatriation would begin within 6 weeks. Ships were being organized to transport displaced persons and former prisoners back to occupied Germany. They would finally be going home. Except home no longer felt like a simple concept. Captain Hartman called a meeting in the main hall to explain the process. The women would be transported to New York, then to ships bound for Bremen or Hamburg. From there, they would be processed through Allied occupation authorities and released to find their families or whatever remained of their former lives. The captain spoke with her usual efficiency, but Katrin noticed something else in her expression. Concern, perhaps, or sadness. After the official announcement, Hartman added something unexpected. "I want you all to know that if anyone wishes to explore legal immigration to the United States, there are processes available. It will not be easy, and I cannot make promises, but options exist for those who qualify." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through everything the women had assumed about their futures. That night, the barracks erupted in whispered conversations that lasted until dawn. Return to Germany meant returning to devastation. The letters from home painted increasingly grim pictures. Cities remained in ruins, food shortages had worsened, the occupation was harsh, former Nazi party members faced denazification proceedings. Even those who had merely served in auxiliary roles might face suspicion or punishment, but staying in America meant something else entirely. It meant choosing comfort over country. It meant abandoning families who needed them. It meant being marked forever as those who had betrayed their homeland for American abundance. It meant living with the knowledge that they had chosen full plates over empty ones, that they had saved themselves while others suffered. Sophie Klein lay in the bunk next to Katrin, speaking into the darkness. "My mother's last letter said they are surviving on turnips and black bread. She lost 20 kilograms. 20. She sounds like she is dying slowly, and I am here eating 3 meals a day, like a coward." Katrin had no answer. Her own mother's letters had stopped coming months ago, and the silence terrified her more than bad news would have. Was her family alive, dead, suffering in ways she could not help? "If we stay," Helga said from across the room, "we can send money back to our families. The Americans pay wages for work. We could help them from here, perhaps more than we could help by being there and just adding another mouth to feed." It was rationalization, and they all knew it. But it was also true. Elsa Becker, the youngest, spoke with unusual force. "I do not want to go back to a country that lied to us about everything, that starved its own people while telling them they were winning, that committed atrocities we knew nothing about. Is that betrayal, or is that simply refusing to return to a place that betrayed us first?" The question hung in the cold February air, unanswered and unanswerable. In 6 weeks, they would have to decide who they were and what home really meant. 20 years later, in 1966, Katrin Bergman stood in the kitchen of her small home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. She was 46 years old now, an American citizen, a translator for the State Department, and someone who still could not waste food. Her daughter, 16-year-old Emma, was setting the table for Sunday dinner, ham and eggs. It had become a family tradition, though Emma did not know why. Katrin had chosen to stay in America. So had Sophie, Helga, and 8 others from Camp Green Lake. They had filled out paperwork, found sponsors, learned to navigate immigration bureaucracy, and built new lives in a country that had once been their enemy. The fast decision had cost them dearly. Katrin's mother had died in 1948 before they could reunite. Her father and brother survived, but their letters carried a coldness that never thawed. She was the daughter who had chosen American comfort over German suffering. Some wounds, she learned, never fully healed, but she had also sent money home every month for 15 years. Money that helped Hans finish school, that paid for her father's medical care, that rebuilt a small part of what the war had destroyed. From America, she had been able to help in ways she never could have managed from inside Germany's devastation. Sophie had married an American veteran and had 3 children. She taught German at a local high school and spent her summers taking food to families in need, as if she could never quite escape the memory of hunger. Helga had become a nurse, working in veterans' hospitals, caring for the same soldiers who had once been her captors. As Katrin cracked eggs into the pan, she thought about that first morning in the mess hall. The shock of abundance, the guilt that followed, the slow, painful realization that everything she had believed was a lie built on other lies. Food had been the first crack in the propaganda. Something as simple as ham and eggs had revealed the vast chasm between what she had been told about America and what America actually was. It had not made the choice easy. It had not erased the guilt. But it had shown her that another way of living was possible. Emma came into the kitchen, drawn by the smell of cooking. "Mom, why do we always have ham and eggs on Sundays?" Katrin flipped the eggs carefully, watching the whites set around golden yolks. How could she explain? How could she tell her American daughter about ration cards and hunger, about propaganda and transformation, about the moment when a simple breakfast shattered a worldview? "Because," she said finally, "I want us to remember that we should never take food for granted. That abundance is not something everyone has. That what seems ordinary to us is extraordinary to others." She plated the eggs and brought them to the table. As her family ate, Katrin said a quiet prayer of gratitude, for second chances, for the Americans who had shown her kindness instead of cruelty, and for ham and eggs, the meal that had changed everything.